Hi everyone, this is Chirag Patel. Welcome to my session, which is building the perfect Microsoft 365 tenant. Just wanted to, if you haven't already heard enough, as you know, we have a conference coming up next year, SharePoint conference, which is what it used to be called. It's going to be called now Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. So try and get to that. And also, big thanks to our sponsors. Without them, this would be impossible to have an event such as this. So if you haven't already, please visit them on the virtual booths and obviously try and get some info that might help your organization. Also, if you take a look at the prize draws there, the raffle, just put your name in there and hopefully you might be lucky to win those. So submit your answers for that. And last but not least, due to the current situation we're in, feel free, please, to donate. Obviously, 10% of the funds from the sponsors are going to all these charities. So yeah. A bit about me. I'm Chirag Patel, based in London, UK. Been working in IT for about 20 years by profession, just by IT pro. I work with various organizations, small and large, mainly working with Microsoft 365, coming from SharePoint, and prior to that, from a SQL Server database development and administration background. Obviously, I work with various gold partners to help deliver solutions to their customers, and that's one of the ways you can connect to me. techchirag.com is probably the best way to get to the site and connect through Twitter, LinkedIn, and other networks there. Whilst I kind of work away, for me, I find the best way to learn everything about Microsoft 365 and related technologies is by attending and speaking at various community events. And I mainly speak and deliver sessions around UK and Europe. And so these are some of those examples of communities out there that I've been sort of part of, and there are many others out there as well. So all my slides get posted on that URL, so feel free to check that out. After this session, the slides will be posted to that URL, so you'll get the slides and as well as recordings at some point in the next couple of weeks. So yeah. So what we're going to cover is essentially from everything to the way Microsoft 365 has evolved through lots of apps and services. It's a constant and never ending, if you like, to try and keep up with all the changes that comes around. And so depending on where you are in your journey for your organization, whether you're starting out new or whether you have Office 365 workloads through the Microsoft 365 platform deployed for a number of years, really doesn't matter. This session is for everybody. So hopefully you will take away some of the good things that you may have not considered properly, or you might have just parked it on the side. But this session will give you a very insightful and very comprehensive overview around things to consider to making sure that your Microsoft 365 tenant is as perfect as possible. So these are some of the items we'll be covering through, roughly just basically understand what Microsoft 365 is all about. Microsoft 365 groups, which is the underpinning foundation, if you like, for a lot of the other services that rely on. We'll look at SharePoint Online as well as Microsoft Teams in terms of its relationships. And then obviously security and compliance, which basically touches across all the workloads and depending on how you go about implementing that as well. And then last but not least is around the adoption and support mechanisms in order to make sure that all your users as well as your technical users and teams are also all on the same page. So what is Microsoft 365? And I know the name changes go all the time, because up until a few weeks, it was called Office 365, especially when you fired up Word or Excel, it used to come up as Office 365. And now you get Microsoft 365. But the desktop applications is one part of it in terms of your Office Pro Plus. But also as part of that Office 365 load, you get your Exchange, your OneDrive, your Yammer, SharePoint, and many other workloads within that as well. But those are the main ones that you get. Not necessarily that they have to be rolled out straight off in kind of big bang. You can obviously break that down in however way you want to sort of roll that out. But also you got business apps as well in there as well. And obviously these are growing as more and more solutions get added to the Office 365 workloads. Then you have your second component, if you like, which is your Windows 10 systems, as well as the Pro versions, and the Enterprise gives you basically full capabilities to manage and upgrade versions between Pro and Enterprise, as well as being able to control the apps deployment as well. And then last but not least, you have your mobility and the security piece as well. So not just protecting your computers within the offices, but also the mobile phones and devices, not just corporate owned, but also for other personal devices as well. And that kind of bring those three things together, kind of brings your Microsoft 365 ecosystem as well. I deliberately haven't put Power Platform in there. It does come with that as well, but I know Power Platform have their own sort of, if you like, slightly different world in terms of their administration, the governance, and everything else. But nevertheless, it is part of Microsoft 365, although their licensing changes that's happened recently are somewhat, kind of challenged to just get to there. So that's Microsoft 365. And then, so, once you kind of deployed it, now depending on from what perspective you approach, depending on how, if it's a technical led program, and yes, we get all excited by all the wonderful features and all the capabilities that kind of you get that help support your business. But nevertheless, why would you want to deploy Microsoft 365? Is it because that's the biggest thing out there? Is there something similar? Or is it because your competitors are already using it and therefore they're kind of ahead of the game? Or is it because your own legacy systems, your kind of, your servers, your desktops, your databases, whatever it is, you've somehow got to kind of put it out in a way that your business can really understand what exactly you're going to do with Microsoft 365. So what I tend to find when I visit various organizations is the focus tends to be very much that let's roll out SharePoint because you get intranet with it, you get capabilities to manage your files through collaboration with Microsoft Teams, your Yammer and everything else. So you can still have that, but this kind of slide, if you like, is probably I would say the most important slide to begin with, to kind of isolate how you're going to carve out your services. And so to that effect, you're able to then advise your users through saying that this is how we're going to roll out Microsoft 365. We're going to use it for, say, internal communication, document management capabilities, not necessarily together in one go. You might sort of decide as and when how you switch on those kind of services, but at least this gives you an idea how you can design your services to meet those technical capabilities that you have. So hopefully this kind of helps. And then there is obviously the link there to give you kind of a full list of all the apps and services. So you got things like Kaizala, you got To-Do and all the other things. So, just make sure that, this is there as in your radar as to which direction you're going with Microsoft 365. So in terms of kind of how you go about deploying it, this is kind of a very kind of a quick overview, if you like, in terms of how you go about deploying things. So you got your foundation infrastructure pieces, and most organizations will start with Exchange or upgrade from Skype to Teams through in conjunction with Exchange as well, depending on how we do it. But kind of you're kind of starting with this foundation, and probably the most important part in that foundation infrastructure I find is the information protection. What I tend to see in other organizations that they tend to roll out Microsoft 365, the desktops and all the service loads, but security for some reason, especially the compliance aspects of it, is normally parked on the side to say that we'll cover that in the future phases. And that's okay as long as the risk is kind of accepted, but how long do you take the risk whereby you keep allowing your users to connect from, say, any devices on the planet to your Microsoft 365? Because by default, if they've got the login details, and if you haven't really protected your kind of devices through, say, the Intune, then anybody can connect as long as they have their login details and obviously the two-factor, multi-factor authentication as well. But this is just a way to kind of make sure that you cover that off, and then you kind of focus on your workloads to say whether you're going to deploy SharePoint and Teams, or you're going to migrate from, say, file shares to SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. So if you kind of work through logically, then you can kind of go further afield and then target specific business scenarios as to what you're going to do with those technologies that you have. And so hopefully that kind of gives a clear guidance around how you go about deploying Microsoft 365. This could take, say, from a few days to a few months, depending on how many users you have in your organization. So obviously the mileage will vary as how fast you go on this path to deploy Microsoft 365. One of the cool things you get with the Microsoft 365 is the fact that if you're new to the tenant and there's so many features and capabilities, then you can go into your admin center and access the deployment advisors. So you've got various deployment advisors there for, say, deploying Microsoft Teams or SharePoint or other workloads. And this is what you see in the screen is basically showing the Microsoft Teams, the way you go about deploying it. So it's a kind of a self-guided support mechanism in order to help you set up your tenant. And it basically kind of takes you through a series of wizards in there in order to how you go about preparing for your teams, your necessary network IP addresses, the licenses that you can allocate to your users. And you kind of go through all those settings bit by bit until you're kind of ready to say, I'm going to go with that. Now, if you're a small organization, then that's great. For a larger organization, you may not wish to use this. But guess what? You can use this in your test tenant if you have one, just to get the idea how this is going to look like if you deploy Microsoft Teams through the deployment advisor. And then you can plan, if you like, to extend that deployment. And you get kind of good, a full set of instructions with the videos. And this is constantly changing through the Microsoft Docs Center there as well. So this gets updated automatically. And you can see that, you got vast info and links in there as well to help you plan in order to get your services through to your users. So that's a kind of a good step to get to it, especially if you got very limited resource who's trying to do so much with Microsoft 365. And then you got the setup screen as well. So you got the setup access within the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. This is live. I find that in most organizations, this gets looked at in the beginning. It's not something that they review regularly. You can regularly review this because this is targeting live to your tenant, and you got those indicators in there, which basically says that those particular features are up to date. But if you got any particular data, let's say credit card information or any other sensitive data, then this will pick up to say that you got some files, some items in your tenant that needs attention. So it gives you a nice little matrix. In this case, obviously there's 0 items, but if you go to your tenant today and go to that setup, And if you haven't got some of those features configured, it will actually tell you that this needs attention, and you can then go ahead and set that up by following these kind of particular areas. And it kind of gives you task details in terms of what is expected of you as a technical person for that. And then it will tell you also what's the impact on the users if you were to switch that on. So you go in this case like retention labels, for example. So that's another quick way to kind of get to your tenant to configuring things very quickly. Obviously, you can go the other way as well to try and read about it and then deploy bit by bit. Okay, so the next part you have is the Microsoft 365 groups. And this is kind of, I find is the important part of the tenant services, because what you get as well is depending on who's managing which workloads. So if you have, say, the Exchange administrators or the infrastructure admins who are in, say, control of provisioning the groups, and let's say they're kind of restricted that users can't deploy, but this group has got dependencies on lots of areas. And in this particular case, when you're creating your Microsoft 365 group, what you're getting essentially is the SharePoint site, the Exchange, the shared calendar, the inbox, the planner, as well as Teams or Yammer, depending on which way you kind of provision these groups. So if you kind of deploy, if you create a SharePoint team site or Microsoft Teams, it will create that, but also it's creating the group as well. And so what becomes, something that starts off very small, but if you go from, let's say 3 months from now or 6 months from now, since you're, rolling out everything else, you'll probably find that you're going to have so many groups. And especially if you're going to allow users to, say, create those teams in Microsoft Teams, then you may get some duplication or some kind of different variations, if you like, of the same group that's having kind of redundant groups. So very important to understand around how you go about, the impact you get when a Microsoft 365 group that gets created. So in order to kind of manage these groups, if you like, so absolutely, you obviously need your security group to be able to have nominated users who can create that. And that might be some folks in IT as well as some folks in the business who understands what that dependency is. And that could be your champions, or it could be anybody. And so at least you can restrict that down who can create those groups, and then obviously be able to configure those policies around how those groups get named, as to when they can expire, or set the reminders to the users that if they're not using that team or the SharePoint site, then it will get deleted, as well as being able to restore those groups as well. And then you can kind of get an idea around what's going on from in your tenant around what kind of groups you have through the reporting as well, and then be able to take the necessary action or kind of partnering, if you like, with your users to understand the rationale behind those groups. So when you create SharePoint sites, then there's kind of from 3 sort of places you can do that here. So whether that's within your Outlook as the Outlook groups, or Microsoft Teams, or even within Yammer. So they kind of do the same thing. They create the Microsoft 365 groups in the background. But when you kind of view them, depending on which apps you're in, so if you're in SharePoint, then you're going to be able to see from all these places, as well as from Stream and Planner as well. And so when you look at Microsoft Stream, which is your kind of a video sharing kind of system, then what you're going to get there is the groups in there sometimes can be confusing to say that, you go your Microsoft Teams, and then they show up those team names in Microsoft Stream. So suddenly that can be an overwhelming experience, but they're kind of the same thing, those groups, whether you see them in Microsoft Teams or in Stream, or even in Planner as well. So Planner is another one that where people create planners from a user perspective. They will not have any idea around that it's creating the Microsoft 365 groups in there as well. So it's just kind of something to bear in mind within that. But having kind of gone through some of that technical jargon, if you like, from a user's perspective, at the end of the day, all they want is some kind of a team space, whether you call it a group or a site, and you'll get all kinds of names with that. We get it all the time, but ultimately, all we know that from now, what they're asking for is a Microsoft Teams workspace, and that's where all the investments are, not just from Microsoft, but generally in the marketplace, all the apps and other integration services you get. So essentially, from my experience, tend to say it's not it is a chat workspace. Of course, that's what Microsoft calls it. I kind of like to keep it simple, that it's Teams workspace. Even like 20 years ago when SharePoint came out, the template, the sites you used to create, they used to be called workspaces as well. So the workspace has just never gone away. So to keep it simple, that's what you get, team workspace with team posts, files, notebooks. So everything's got team in there, just to keep the terminology simple for all the users in the organization. So then kind of, going back to your naming conventions around how you name, whether it's a SharePoint site or Microsoft Teams, or even those groups, that's kind of depending on those. It really doesn't matter what you call them, as long as everybody understands what's the purpose of those groups. And so you may want to kind of prefix or suffix those names depending on how big of an organization you are, depending on where you are as well. And so that way you can kind of keep it really neat and tidy, and more importantly, you can sort of manage as to what's the group's purposes. The common scenario I normally get is what's the difference between Teams and SharePoint. So when you look at that considerations there, you may create different SharePoint sites for managing your kind of a document management life cycle, or for your teams, you may kind of create for all the collaboration purposes. You'll still have your SharePoint site within them, but you may want to call them different things for different purposes. So it really depends how you kind of manage your documents, the libraries and everything else within that team. So from a SharePoint perspective, because it is a huge platform, historically, from SharePoint perspective, it's obviously got the capability to deliver the intranet team collaboration capabilities. But again, if this is not defined in terms of how you're going to use SharePoint, then this kind of helps you to isolate at least what's the purpose of rolling out SharePoint and what you're going to do with it. Because you may have a third-party document management system where you may not want to use SharePoint in this case, but then if suddenly you deploy Microsoft Teams, then your SharePoint sites are going to get created. So from a user perspective, that's already an overwhelming experience that they have a third-party document management system, as well as they have the Teams team as well that's got the SharePoint site. So there is that kind of junction where, if you like, there's a convergence happening whereby, at some point, the third-party document management system just gets kind of considered to migrate into SharePoint. But depending on how you use it, and then Project Cortex, there's a lot of sessions going on around that in terms of what's coming. So that's kind of the next area around the knowledge networks as well. So when you do invest in SharePoint, then just be mindful as to what's coming your way and the things you can do within that. And obviously it's got its huge development ecosystem as well, where you can build all the clever solutions on top of SharePoint platform itself. So kind of isolate your services from that. So you got your SharePoint, yes, you got your file shares. You may have migrated your file shares, or you're planning to do them because you're getting a new team, or you're kind of getting your mergers and acquisitions, whatever the scenarios are. And you may have historical SharePoint platforms, on-premise SharePoint services and everything else. But these are kind of some of the considerations that you can think about in terms of when you migrate those information workloads. So, with SharePoint, especially specifically the web parts, the content types you may have built over the years, the metadata and everything else. So all these are kind of factors to consider as to how that's going to look like in your new world. Yes, you can do site-by-site migration. That's going to bring everything across, and you've got all the good third-party tools out there that can help you do that, as well as being able to promote what used to be called subsites They still exist anyways, but it's just not the best ways to go about doing rolling those out. So to make that behavior to look like the sub-site, what you would now create is something like a hub site and have your respective SharePoint sites associated with the hub site as well. So they kind of achieve the same behavior and the effect, if you like, in terms of having that parent-child hierarchy, if you like, for your sites. So depending on how much you have invested in your on-prem SharePoint, then the migration is an area to consider how long that would be, depending on how we do it. The Microsoft Teams, when you kind of deploying Microsoft, Teams around that, there's huge dependencies around. We kind of touched briefly that when you create the Microsoft Office 365 groups, then obviously it's creating Teams, SharePoint, and everything else. But you can see that the detailed guidance there around what creates what services, and depending on what it is, where it's storing. So you got your chats and everything else, the meetings storing in Exchange, Stream, and in the Azure Media Services. So it's something to think about, because obviously Microsoft 365 still being part of the Azure, so you have other areas to consider in terms of how the architecture is going to look like. But this is a starting point to understand the different workloads that you get involved in that as well. Skype for Business, obviously that's coming to an end soon, and if you like, so a lot of the organizations are already moving, or they're starting off with Microsoft Teams, and one of the clients that I had to work with were to move them from Skype for Business. This is something that's from Microsoft in terms of the upgrade framework, where you get all the necessary samples of plans, and we basically tailor this around how to get the users from A to B, if you like, to manage their change, to upgrade that, but also being able to kind of tailoring that. This is obviously in Excel, but you can do a lot more with that. So depending on how you kind of upgrade your Skype for Business users, you may tailor this plan accordingly. So again, if you have, we'll talk about champions in a minute, but you may want to sort of work with them in a way that kind of helps you to get from Skype for Business to Teams very quickly. The default, if you can, or the faster you can, it's better, is the Teams mode if you can, although there are 4 different types of modes at least, depending on how you kind of bring those across, whether you have your calling plans as well as being just using Skype for Business for, say, chats. In some organizations when I visit, I think documentation is very important, because even though Microsoft 365 Tenant changes constantly, if there are no design documents and you're kind of, if you like, doing things ad hoc way and configuring changes, settings, and all those things, and if anything goes wrong, and I have seen some tenants go down where just by some changes that's not been documented, or at least not gone through the change control processes, then at least one of the good things you can do as the admin teams around here is being able to document that, either using through PowerShell scripts or literally just manually documenting each setting that you have. And this is something I use when I visit kind of various clients to document their tenants. And so that at least they have something to begin with to kind of manage their configurations and documentations around the Microsoft 365. This should be in the beginning, if you like, because security and compliance is something that on the beginning of the journey that should really take place to kind of help you to deliver your services. But more often what happens is that it's always an IT's problem in order to try and deal with the security and compliance. And I think, we're all aware that it's not just an IT thing, business has to be involved. But how do you go about involving them? How do you kind of start those conversations to make them aware that the sooner you kind of get onto this path to make sure that your necessary security policies and the implementations around those controls, your retention labels, sensitive labels, and everything else, then obviously the more positioned that the good you are once you get that started. So you got kind of, in some organizations, they don't even have a security officer. So then how's the IT going to work with the business in order to own the security and the compliance pieces. But obviously, as we are kind of working from home, a lot of the organizations, then it's now more important than ever before to kind of make sure your tenant is more secure and controlled from virtually any endpoints of your devices that there are. And so what I tend to kind of work with is, kind of initially kind of training, the not just the technical teams, but even for the business user, somebody who's going to be either looking after the compliance, and this doesn't have to be looked after by the IT. This can be looked after by the business in order to kind of giving them access to the compliance administration side of things. And it kind of just gives you, if you already haven't seen it, and there's a raft of info and info types here, as well as some of the configurations. So from Microsoft's perspective, you have the security score as well as compliance scores. And so their scores are always 100% because they have their necessary policies, everything else. And you can sort of have a look at that in your tenant as to what those particular configuration policies and settings are. But this is, kind of giving you up-to-date information around how you can update that and being able to kind of manage your scores. And then within your compliance center, you have obviously all these areas that you can switch on or off for your ease of navigation, your DLPs and everything else. So you can kind of go through a lot of that. Record management came recently, generally available. So kind of go around creating these labels. And the best thing ways to try it out with your users, few users, pilot it out, see what the experience looks like, document it, and then kind of educate everybody in the organization before you roll that out. Even though this is something that doesn't come built in, the capability is there in the tenant, but it's not configured for you to be able to kind of apply those labels and everything else. So that's something you have to do manually, bring that across. But you got some templates in there already to help you get started. So do visit that, and then obviously keep an eye on that from a monitoring capability. So in order to get that conversation going, that it's all very well, you got the security centers, compliance centers, and everything else, but then how do you kind of document those policies? So these are kind of, if you like, a handful of policies. There could be more than that, depending on how your organization is stricter or relaxed around how you kind of document these. There's a link over there for business decision makers. It's plain English. It's even got the Excel spreadsheet on that link as well. And you can literally just hand them over that to say, look, if your tenant is not configured with any of this, I'm hoping that you've got MFA, everything enabled, even for your admins, then at least you can say, look, these are the policies that needs to be considered and be implemented. And so you kind of go one by one. And for each of these policies, there is the setting around how that setting looks like, how you're going to document it, how you're going to configure it, and then be able to work through this step by step in order to kind of get through that policies. So essentially looking after your identities, your devices as to whether they're corporate devices or personal devices, and then your apps itself. Are you going to let personal devices have SharePoint on them and Microsoft Teams to access your corporate information? So you can then kind of go through logically around who you're going to block those things and not. So, that's hopefully kind of makes the start to have those conversations and then start implementing, and then obviously refine them as you go through that process. External sharing, some organizations, they actually kind of disable it. By default, it's on. Some then disable it afterwards. But in this kind of modern age, depending on how you collaborate, you definitely need to have external collaboration. It's not always just internal, but these are the kind of settings within your Microsoft 365 as to, kind of the main switch, whether you're going to let your users add the new guests, and then whether within the groups itself, whether group owners can share or the members can share as well. So you can control those settings there. Microsoft Teams by default is off. So even though the main switch on the tenant is on, you can control the guest access within Microsoft Teams if you want to switch that on. And then SharePoint has its own capability of managing external sharing, goes to the site level specific as well to be able to control which site can be enabled for external sharing. And then OneDrive, of course, is there as well. I know from some example where OneDrive was kind of left on for everybody in some organization, and they literally were running their marketing department on a specific user's OneDrive. So the sort of things you can do with all these file management tools is there, but again, it's the difference between OneDrive versus SharePoint, because if the user leaves, the OneDrive goes as well. The other setting that you need to be considered of is the integrated apps. So depending on, by default, this is on. So you have your add-ins as well, not just for your Office, but also from Outlook. So within Exchange Admin Center, you can actually kind of turn that off if you don't want users to have that. In some organizations, they use Find Me, and they can just download straight away. They use it. To admin surprise, they find that they have no control over how they kind of got that, especially if they didn't have the opportunity to investigate what the actually app does and how it works and how you manage and support if things don't go right. So that's kind of how you kind of go around managing your add-ins. And then from the integrated apps perspective, if you have some third-party companies or holiday companies, whoever it is, if they use Microsoft Sign-In way to get the sign-in information, and your users will not realize that they can sign in with Microsoft, and if they kind of connected through their login on their work browser and they'll go to their website, potentially they're kind of signing in with your corporate account to that third-party company. So something to be aware of that, because if you do that, you then again giving somebody access to that individual's OneDrive folder and files capabilities as well. So to manage everybody, all the users in terms of, because obviously to try and keep up is one thing, but then being able to support your users with the documentation, everything else, and Microsoft over the years have become very good in terms of documenting through their docs.microsoft.com website. But the main thing is that you now have a SharePoint solution. I know there are some sessions going on where they're specifically on the learning pathways. If you haven't, then do check out on that link. But essentially, it's your SharePoint site that you get in your own tenant, and all the documentation that's coming from Microsoft's own docs.microsoft center. So you're kind of getting your own demand videos and all the apps where users can access, and you can of course tailor it by adding your own playlists if you have some third-party systems as well. But especially from an adoption perspective, if you're going to be following on, say, events, hosting lunch and learn sessions, customer successes, stories, you name it, everything else, Yammer, web parts, whatever, you can bring all that into this single SharePoint site and kind of make sure that's kind of rolled out to everybody so that they can access all those things as well, even when you're rolling out new features and so on. So you can switch on and off if you don't want people to visit certain documentation within that. So once you've got your kind of, your tenant up and running, you got everything configured, no doubt you're going to get demands from users as to, can they have shifts, for example, in Teams. You may roll that out and may let them roll that out, enable that depending on how you do it. But roughly, kind of, if you look at this process, then, don't ignore them. They get logged as a service ticket, but depending on the early stage, if you're from a go live perspective, then I think take those kind of opportunities as requirements, if you like, review them, with your architects teams. Some of those capabilities might be huge if you're going to roll out some other apps, for example, especially if you say Power Apps, Power Automate, if you're going to enable those things for, working with, say, CDS, which is quite an expensive option. Whatever it is, you may have to go through that budget approvals as well. Review that architecturally to see if that's going to be in line with your tenant and your other systems. Review those options, and then obviously inform the user around that. If you're not going to do it, then when you're going to do it, because otherwise they're going to find different ways of getting their requirements addressed. So hopefully that kind of makes sure that you have that feature request process in their place. One of the biggest things I find around is that any projects that go with Microsoft 365 workloads, everything else, the training for, especially for the technical teams, is always left to the last in most cases, or they're assumed that they're just going to pick it up, They're going to just read up, attend some videos, learn the bits that they want to do. In my view, I think that's the first thing they should be doing before you even go out and even extending that rollout before, because there's a huge number of changes that's going on. But this is a certification path to become the Microsoft 365 Enterprise Admin Expert. But you don't have to do all those courses, but you can see the kind of workloads that's involved to kind of what it takes. So it's a huge system. It's not just SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. There's a lot more to it. And this is where it will help your technical teams to be ahead, if you like, and what's coming, and kind of, you know, making sure that they're knowledge, experience for the things that they do. So, excuse me. So you have the admin center, which again goes through a lot of changes. So these are kind of the sections of different admin centers with various sections. I try and keep up with this section because every time when I go to the document center, the admin center, then it depends how you've configured. But at least this is one way of kind of keeping your record around what is where in which admin center. And I know especially security and compliance centers, there is some interchangeable, if you like, your DLP and the compliance elements you can access in both places. So, you know, that's kind of trying to keep up around which bits of admin centers in there. And then from a Microsoft 365 landscape perspective, in terms of the release mechanism, how it works, and you know, it's very transparent, and there are some community folks out there, especially Chris Hood, who kind of just madly just blogs everything and tweets everything as well. Every time there's a change in the roadmap and everything else. But yeah, this is another way, you know, look at this on a daily basis if you can. And then that way you know what's coming and not get surprised by anything that may get switched on, but also being able to involving your business users in that as well, and trying out those previews and other new functionality that you get as part of your Microsoft 365. And so that way you're constantly moving, if you like, in terms of your release mechanisms. The other aspect that's become a lot more easier is that if you do roll something out, and this is on your admin center as well, the what's new, and here you have a full control as to what the users can see when they switch onto their Word or Excel, depending on what that is, and depending on what version of your the channels you might be for your Office programs, then at least you can say that, you know, what's coming that way, and at least this is still documented from Microsoft perspective, whereas before that was just for a user's discretion to be able to find out what's new, or you do some kind of an ad hoc mechanism, if you like, to be able to tell the users through saying new features will get added, or in the Microsoft 365 adoption site that we had a look at it earlier, you may post a specific news within that. So this is kind of become a very useful tool to use. It says preview, it was up to preview a few months ago, and this is kind of gone full version of it as well. So you can control what gets hidden, what features. It necessarily doesn't disable the feature, it's just from a help perspective. And then in order to kind of keep your kind of skills up to date, if you like, you know, the enterprise test labs, if you like, each of those can be tried out. So if you don't have access to a tenant, suggest you have a test tenant to at least try things out. But you got at least these exercises here you can try as well, being able to kind of understand how does privileged access management work, you know, data classification, what's the process to go through if you was to configure from start to finish. So you kind of got all those good, useful functionalities in there in order to kind of stack yourself up to make sure that your tenant is kind of built perfectly around that. So that was kind of, if you like, a very kind of a whirlwind tour, if you like, of Microsoft 365. It's almost kind of impossible to cover everything within kind of 45 minutes, but hopefully I've covered enough, and hopefully it's given you sort of kind of more opportunity around to look at what there is within Microsoft 365. So just wanted to say thanks for joining us, and please visit the site and for donations to make the donations. And obviously, rely on your feedback heavily because it is a community event. Nobody gets paid for doing this. So, good, bad, whatever it is, feel free to give us feedback. And thanks for joining me. And I'll take the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chirag.
Thanks.
And here we have some questions. Do you see the Q&A panel? Do you?
Yeah, I'm just going to switch over now. Yeah.
Okay, that's the last one.
Yes, I see it.